Happy New Year. Welcome to the Kim Iverson Show. Glad you could join us on this New Year's Day. Hopefully 2024 is going to be better than 2023. We are absolutely hoping for a great and exciting year, but got to be honest, can't help but to notice that it feels like we continue to inch towards a major war. Now, ideally, cooler heads will prevail, but just last week, Lindsey Graham was making the news rounds calling for us to bomb Iran. In fact, he was saying we should, quote, blow Iran off the map. That's probably not a surprise coming from Lindsey Graham, but it's really definitely, could you imagine being Iran and hearing this type of stuff? This came shortly after Israel killed an Iranian general in an airstrike in Syria. So are we headed for a wider war? Why do Israel and the U.S. hate Iran in the first place? Why did the Iran nuclear deal fall apart? Why did Trump take out Soleimani? And why hasn't Iran, more importantly, why hasn't Iran, luckily, in a lot of ways, responded to these provocations? With us tonight is Trita Parsi. Trita is an Iranian-born author and analyst. He is the co-founder and executive vice president of the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which is a DC-based think tank that opposes the military-industrial complex and advocates for restraint in U.S. foreign policy. Trita is also the founder and former president of the National Iranian-American Council, which looked to promote a greater understanding between the American and Iranian people. He is the author of Treacherous Alliance, The Secret Dealings of Israel, Iran, and the United States, A Single Roll of the Dice, Obama's Diplomacy with Iran, and his latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. Trita, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Thanks so much for having me.
Let's hope it's a happy year, not just a happy new year, but a whole happy year, and that there's no war. But it looks like we're getting closer. Let's start off with why Iran. Why do you think Iran hasn't responded harshly to the provocations? They do small responses, but they haven't allowed anything at this point. And there's been a lot of provocations against Iran over the years. They haven't allowed any of it to escalate to a wider war.
It is a great question because there's a debate raging inside of Iran right now, and there are more and more voices, particularly amongst the hawkish elements of the regime, that believe that Iran's deterrence against Israel is falling apart and Iran has to respond.
Ugh.
And the other side of the debate are those who say that Iran has to play the long game, a confrontation directly with Israel and the Israelis is something that Iran likely would lose. It would be extremely costly for the United States and certainly for Israel, but it wouldn't have the favorable outcome. But if they play the long game, and if just take a look what's happened in the last 10 years, Iran is the main reason as to why Hezbollah is such a powerful military force. It's a key reason as to why the Houthis now have the technology that they do, in which they've been able to target ships in the Red Sea, why they've been able to defeat the Saudis, etc. So the longer game is part of the reason why the Iranians have not responded. But we don't know. Perhaps at this point there will be a response from the Iranians and there will be a direct confrontation. Now, the Iranian red line, as it has been communicated, is that they will not respond unless Iran is hit on Iranian soil. It's the same red line that the Lebanese Hezbollah has put forward, in which they say that they will not enter the war in Gaza unless Israel invades Lebanon. Now, of course, there's skirmishes between between Hezbollah and Israel going on all the time, but that's unfortunately almost always the case. It's certainly intensified since Gaza, but not in a way that it's actually escalated into a much larger war. But so that's the official red line. Can they sustain that red line if there are not only more attacks in Gaza, which we will see, potentially an Israeli invasion of Lebanon, and on top of that, further Israeli assassinations of Iran?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, I understand that logic coming from them, but they have been sabotaged quite a bit by the Israelis. I mean, I don't know if it's been confirmed, but there's certainly been a lot of suspicion that the Israelis had been taking out a lot of their infrastructure inside of Iran.
Certainly. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the Israelis, one can definitely make the argument that the Israelis have humiliated the Iranians in many different ways. They've taken out a lot of their different scientists as well as leaders of their missile program. a very key person in the Iranian nuclear program was assassinated inside of Iran by an AI robot.
Oh,
I mean, it
geez.
was taken straight out of a James Bond movie in which they had smuggled the pieces in, assembled it inside of Iran, and then, by remote control in Israel, they took out this very senior person from the Iranian nuclear program. On the other hand, you can also make this argument, which is that all of these different things that the Israelis have done, including, incidentally, the Stuxnet virus that they, together with the US, put in the Iranian nuclear program that destroyed big parts of it, that all of them have done tremendous damage to the Iranian program, to Iran's military, but none of them have had a strategic impact on the trajectory of Iran's military program as well as its civilian nuclear program. So, for instance, the Iranian drones, the missile capabilities they have are still by and large intact. They've been set back, but the Iranians have bounced back. The nuclear program is more advanced than it ever has been. So one can also make the argument that playing the long game has worked out for the Iranians. Instead of, let's say, if they had really lashed out a year ago or 5 years ago and there would have been a major war, what would the situation have looked then for the Iranians?
I got to be honest, if I were Iran, I'd be scrambling to get myself some nukes. I mean, this whole, that's just from a logical perspective. We've seen also recently there were calls from, I think there was France and the UK and the United States telling Iran, hey, tone it down with your nuclear program. We see that you're escalating it. We want you to stop it. I mean, look, if they wanted Iran to stop it, they would have done the Iran nuclear deal, I suppose, stayed in it, and we could get to that. But why would Iran listen to them? I mean, when I saw that news that, they've written, they've told Iran to back it down, I'm thinking, why would they listen to you at all after you take out a general? Have Lindsey Graham on the news saying things like, let's blow Iran off the map. If I were Iran, the only thing I'd be focused on at this point is getting myself some nukes, especially since Israel has nukes. We know they've got nukes. It's unconfirmed, which is the worst type because you can't inspect them. So they've got how many warheads? 400 warheads or something of nukes, and we can't even inspect them because they're off the books. So why is Israel allowed to have all of these nukes and Iran's not allowed to have nukes to defend itself when it's got warmongers saying, let's blow it off the map? I mean, if I were them, I'd be scrambling.
So I think the logic you're presenting makes sense if Iran was only focusing on the United States. If it's only focusing on the United States, it's seeing this threat, it's seeing the rhetoric, the attacks by Israel, etc. And a conclusion can then be reached that, yes, if Iran had nukes, it would have the deterrence against this. Certainly the Israelis would not be doing a lot of these different things if Iran had nukes, and nor would the US. But Iran's calculation, I think, is a bit more complicated and wider than that. And that's what it's been so far. I'm not saying that this is the way it's going to stay. I think, in fact, there is a likelihood that it will change. But part of the reason why the Iranians, contrary to the assumption in Washington, in my view, were never dead set on getting a nuke. Their calculation was different. Even during the time of the Shah, the Iranians were trying to get all of the technology necessary to be able to have a nuclear weapon, but then stay short of actually building the weapon. And the reason for that was this. Iran's major advantage in the region is its conventional strength. It is one of the largest countries in the region. Its geographic situation makes it one of the most strategically important nations in the world. It has a population of 80 million. It has a scientific industrial base that, at least up until recently, was the second strongest in the region. It has its own military industrial base. As long as the region is non-nuclear, with the exception of Israel, Iran is a regional superpower. But if Iran builds a nuclear weapon and risks spreading nuclear weapons in the region, because the Saudis have said that they will build one if Iran has one, Turkey will build one if Iran has one, then suddenly, to a large extent, Iran's conventional military superiority will be erased, and Iran will find itself in a very different strategic environment. Let's just take an example. An Israeli general told me this. He said that India was 10 times the size of Pakistan up until India tested a nuclear bomb. Once it tested a nuclear bomb and Pakistan tested a nuclear bomb, they were equals. And that was a huge strategic mistake for the Indians. This would be the equivalent of Iran going for a nuclear weapon and then Bahrain building or buying one. And then suddenly Iran, that is like, 30, 40 times the size of Bahrain, would find itself equal, at parity with Bahrain. So there's a reason why the two most populous countries in the region, Egypt and Iran, introduced the resolution, the idea of a non-nuclear Middle East at the UN in 1973, Iran and Egypt, because those are the two countries that have the most to lose if the region goes nuclear. Israel, which is a very small state with no strategic depth, has a completely different calculation. Now, Washington's decision makers really never took this into account, but they assumed that Iran was like Pakistan. And that, as you know, famously, the Pakistanis said that they will eat grass, but they will have a nuclear weapon. They will give up everything to have that nuclear weapon. Well, Pakistan is a relatively smaller country next to a giant India, and as a result, had that calculation. Iran did not. In fact, the Iranian nuclear program has been going on for more than 50 years. They still don't have a nuclear weapon. The Pakistanis built a nuclear weapon from scratch in 9.5 years. If the Iranians wanted a nuclear weapon, if it was really the singular thing that they were most focused on, most likely they would have had it by now. And we have to ask ourselves then, why don't they? Which is the question you asked. And I think, again, it goes to the fact that there's a much more complex geopolitical calculation that they have. All of this can change, however, particularly if the threat from the United States, as perceived by the Iranians, becomes so acute that ends up becoming the dominant variable in their calculation. In that scenario, then I think it is feasible that they may actually make the calculation that they're better off going for bomb. There is a group of, there is a voice inside the Iranian regime that is growing stronger, that is essentially making the argument that given what happened with the JCPOA, the West will never accept Iran. And Iran is already paying the cost of having a nuclear weapon because of all of these sanctions. So it might as well just build one. And I think that voice is getting stronger inside of Iran. I think it would be to the detriment of the region as a whole. I think it would be less safe of a world if more countries had a nuclear weapon. But I think also the miscalculation and wrongful policy on the Western side has been a very strong contributor and will be a very strong contributor if the Iranians go in that direction.
But you bring up a really good point. Well, for one, I'd like to just kind of emphasize the fact that the Middle Eastern countries, as much as the West, you've got a lot of people who believe, Muslims, they're really violent people, and yet where are all the nukes? The nukes are with the West primarily. And you've got the Middle East there saying we don't want to be nuclearized. We want a peaceful, non-nuclear region, which is very smart, especially since there are factions that we absolutely would not want to have nukes in their hands, have nukes falling into the hands of real terrorist organizations. That would be devastating. But then again, who's the only country in the world that's ever dropped a nuke, right? Who's the real terrorist? I don't know. Or I do know. So that's just kind of an interesting thing to emphasize there, is to really say, look, the Middle East has remained, and it's not because they don't have the capacity. I mean, Iran has a very high rate of scientists, and science is very big in Iran. There are a lot of scientists in Iran, women and men, so they have absolutely capability and the brain power to develop anything that they want in that country, from my understanding.
Certainly.
The other thing is, looking at the map, the placement of Iran, very difficult, it would seem, to go to war with Iran. It has geographically an excellent position with water around it. You've got, Afghanistan on one side and Iraq on the other, and I know that's pretty scary, right, for Iran. They could think that that's kind of a scary proposition with the Americans that were in Afghanistan, same thing with Iraq, but America was not successful in those areas. So the risk of, if the United States had been successful and were stronger in those areas, I could see a threat to Iran. But the fact that the United States was not successful in those areas means that Iran is safer from any sort. So I guess the question would be, what would a war even look like? Like, what would be because it's not a territorial gain. Lebanon, I could understand because Israel could take Lebanon. So if there was a war that broke out between those two, that would maybe be the gain that Israel would get would be to actually occupy or annex Lebanon. But what do you do with Iran? I mean, would you think that, like, how would Iran lose?
Look, war with Iran would be a complete disaster. You pointed out that, the U.S. was not successful in Afghanistan and in Iraq. I mean, of course, in Iraq, it was a military defeat of Saddam within just 3 weeks, but winning the peace and winning the war are two different things.
Right.
In Afghanistan, ultimately, there was also a military defeat, of course. But Iran is 4 times the size. Population is much larger. Geography is very, very different from Iraq. Mountainous, very difficult to penetrate. The Romans got stopped by the Persians. The Ottomans got stopped by the Persians, partly because of the geography. So it will be extremely difficult. So then the argument is, it's not going to be an invasion. It's just going to be surgical strikes, taking out their capabilities, etc. That will never be successful. It would mean that the Israelis would have to do the mowing the grass type of strategy that they're currently doing in Gaza every 2 years, bombard the place. All we know is that in such scenarios, the program would just go underground. All of the inspectors that currently actually are inside the Iranian nuclear program with the IAEA would be kicked out, and we would have no idea what's going on. And it's a pretty large country. You have plenty of places to be able to hide things if that is what you're trying to do. So there's no scenario that I've seen that actually would make a war with Iran a success. I saw one assessment by the Pentagon that listed that to actually truly be successful, you have to invade the country. You would have to have minimum of 500,000 troops, as well as several 100,000 troops from allied countries in Europe, etc. And it would have to be a commitment of about 10 years in order for this to be successful. So this is a disaster. This is not something that the United States can afford. And I think what the Biden administration is doing right and wrong right now, I think it's wise in recognizing that any escalation, any widening of the war of Gaza would be a disaster. But I think it's wrong in the way that it thinks that it can contain that war, because all it does right now, we can go into it deeper, is try to deter Iran and the Houthis and Hezbollah, which is one element of it, but it cannot be the only element. The most important element is to also put pressure on the Israelis. In fact, the most obvious way of evading an enlarged war that would bring in Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iran would be to have a ceasefire in Gaza. But the most obvious path, the most obvious option is the one that Biden seems the least inclined to.
Yeah, because I don't know if he's in charge anymore. I mean, clearly, it looks like Israel has. I don't know if this has always been the case, and we've just been under the illusion that Israel's the little brother to the United States and that the United States is really in charge. But at some point, I mean, it's really clear now that Israel doesn't care what the United States says, is not listening, and is really the one's in charge.
Kim. I would challenge that a little bit, Kim. I think that is, frankly, the narrative that the Biden administration is putting forward, that the Israelis are just not going to listen. I don't think that's the thing. I think what's happening is that the Biden administration is not even trying. They're not actually putting any pressure on the Israelis. If the United States were to actually put pressure on Israel, make any military support contingent upon Israel living up to our demands, then we have historical examples in which it has worked out quite well. 1982, President Reagan got tired of the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. It wasn't looking good. Evening News was showing it. People in America were turning against the Israelis. And he put pressure on Menachem Begin, and they had a phone call. And he said, I'm not going to send you any more F-16s. I'm going to make this public until you pull out. Within half hour, the Israelis shifted, and they made a decision to pull out. So when we actually put pressure and we put forward consequences, the United States has a tremendous amount of leverage. I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah.
The cost, however, is politically for the president. Domestic political cost. And I think what's happening here is that Biden doesn't want to pay the political cost domestically for putting pressure on Israel. It's not that the Israelis won't listen, they don't care. It's true, they don't care because we haven't made them care. We can make them care, but Biden doesn't want.
Yeah, I guess I think in my mind, the money must out. It always comes down to money. Because that would be our leverage on Israel is the money. It's whether or not we're going to give you money, we're going to give you or things of value that cost money, right? So it's a money game. It seems that the domestic money that is flowing into these campaigns is greater than perhaps the money that we give to Israel. So we're more dependent on our side on the Israeli lobby money than Israel is reliant on U.S. aid money. And so because it's outweighed, they have more power. I mean, that's what it looks like from my viewpoint.
So I think you're putting your finger on something very important, which is that there is a tremendous amount of money that is going around to specific candidates as long as they're taking very strong pro-Israeli positions. But we have to then also separate that. That is not that the U.S. has to do so. This is politicians making bad decisions and going for what's good for them, not what's good for the country.
Right.
And it's a major, major problem. And I think in this specific case, I think the Biden administration may have reached a conclusion that by now they've so deep into this that if they were to shift their position now, they would not regain the young Americans that have abandoned Biden because they simply cannot tolerate genocide. And he's not going to win them back. But if he shifts, he may lose some of the people that he's managed to retain or who he's managed to attract, at least in terms of donors. So I think he's put himself in a very bad position. I think this was quite predictable. There was a frustrating call between Biden and Netanyahu just the other day. And all Biden is asking for is that for the Israelis to release the money to the Palestinian Authority. He's not really asking for anything really big, any consequential thing in terms of the war. And Netanyahu was apparently not particularly susceptible. But how can Biden be surprised? He's known Netanyahu for 25, 30 years. He knows exactly that this is what he would be doing. He knows exactly that at the point when the United States finally comes to the realization that he has to put a stop to this war, guess what? Netanyahu will blame Biden domestically in Israel and say the reason why we didn't win this war is because of Biden. And that will be played in the American elections in November next year. And all of the support that Biden thought that he was going to gain by taking this very strong pro-Israeli stance is going to be washed away by Netanyahu's own statements, blaming Biden for the loss of the war.
Yeah.
So I just have a really hard time seeing how the administration thought that this was going to work out.
Well, I just think they were taken off guard. I mean, I think that this has always been for 75 years, the play has been side with Israel, whatever, side with Israel. And suddenly, and the American people always supported it. And it was politically popular. And now suddenly it's not. And so I think they're just taken off guard. I think that they're just like dumbfounded with, oh my gosh, this shift,
they really miscalculated. I think
changed.
You're quite right. Yeah. And I think the other thing that they're miscalculating is that they're seeing that the young voters are abandoning Biden, but they think it's okay. Come November, Trump is going to be out there. Abortion, other issues are going to bring young voters back to Biden. And I think that is true to a certain extent. Some people will. What I think they're miscalculating, though, is that for a lot of young Americans, the Gaza war, the manner in which the Israelis have done this, the manner in which Biden has given them all the enabling that he could, this has been a formative experience for a lot of young Americans. The first major formative political experience was George Floyd. This is George Floyd internationalized, which means this is not something that they're easily going to forget. And on top of that, this issue is still going to be around for another 6 months, given how Israel is handling this war. And as a result, it's going to be really difficult to forget. And I think that's going to end up costing the Biden administration tremendously and potentially cause them to lose the elections.
Yeah, and this is, I think, we've all been conditioned since birth, particularly since World War II, to understand that the worst atrocity in the world is genocide. That is what we have been conditioned. That's worse than anything that could happen to any group of people is genocide. So I think you're right that this is a very transformative and formative event for younger people. They're witnessing their once in a generation event that they want to stop. They're seeing it happen in real time, and they're saying we cannot allow this to happen. They're living in the era of World War II. It's like they've been transported to World War II, and it's a what would you do moment. Would you stand against Holocaust, or do you ignore it like so many did for so long? And I think that's what they're viewing, how they're viewing this, because it looks very similar.
Because they are freed from all of this other baggage in which all of these other prisms that we're been told that we have to look at these different things instead of looking at reality as it is. Already from the outset, this side is the victim, regardless of the fact that side is not the victim. And young Americans are not looking at it that way. But on top of that, also because of what Russia did to Ukraine and the position that the United States took and said, we have to stand in the way of this. This is genocide. A couple of hospitals were hit immediately. Administrations were talking about war crimes. Now they don't even want to use that word at all. They're not in a position to judge. Who are they to have an opinion on this, et cetera, et cetera. The degree of the hypocrisy and the double standard are simply intolerable, particularly mindful of the fact that this happened so close in time. If there had been 10 years between Ukraine and Gaza, perhaps people would have forgotten. But how could they possibly have forgotten what just happened?
Yeah, exactly. The imagery is much, much worse coming out of Gaza because it is much, much worse. I mean, to the point where Russia's condemning what is happening. So it's terrible. But going to the election, do you think that, I mean, this is where I struggle because I see, okay, Biden is terrible. He's just ignoring this, and he does have the power. And even if he doesn't have, I think that they're worried. One of the reasons why I don't think they push and they don't threaten Israel to stop is because I do think that they're worried that they really have genuinely lost their power, and it would be completely embarrassing if they said, all right, we're cutting you off from all of these things, and Israel says, okay, we don't care. We got all the American, then our donors. Care. What's that?
Israel would care.
Well, we take that gamble. We think they would, but what if they didn't?
Well, no.
And then that would be completely embarrassing.
I don't think this is speculative. Biden has shipped more than 10,000 tons of weapons and artillery to Israel since October 7th in more than 240 ships and 20 aircraft. The speed in which the Israelis are using up the ammunition is such that a European diplomat told me if the Americans stopped with the shipments, Israel will have to stop the war in 5 days. We have leverage. We're not.
Okay, so if it really
There's no way the Israelis, given the speed and the intensity of that they're using weapons, if the U.S. actually stopped, Israelis would have to stop.
Yeah. Okay, then it's like treason of some kind that our political class is so in bed with a foreign country that they're willing to do what's best for that foreign country and not what's best for the American people. That to me, I think there needs to be more light shined on that. The fact that they seem to be, they're just so in bed because of the political donations, whatever it might be. I mean, that is.
And I think they would present a geopolitical argument saying that at the end of the day, Hamas combined with Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iran are all threats to the Middle East. They're destabilizing factors in the region, and the region is important to the United States for a variety of reasons. And as a result, this is also our fight. I think that argument falls apart rather easily. If that is the case, why does the United States not want to enlarge the war?
Right.
If that is the case, then then you should actually be welcoming it. We're not seeing that. But more importantly, the Middle East is not that important to the United States. This is not the previous century in which the oil was that important. This is not a scenario in which we actually are facing potential regional hegemons that can actually take over the Middle East. No state in the region has the capacity of dominating the region. And as a result, the United States can actually, take a step back. And yes, there might be instability, etc. But there's no country that's going to be able to take over all of the energy resources of the region. And frankly, most importantly, the evidence we've seen so far is that when the United States steps back, the other regional countries, save Israel, actually move in a direction of trying to resolve their own tensions diplomatically.
Yeah.
Because to many of them, the utility of some of these conflicts has been because they've had America backing them up. Without America backing them up, they're not really in the mood of fighting, and they're actually moving towards diplomacy. This is what we saw immediately after Trump refused to attack Iran when the Iranians took out or attacked Saudi oil fields in 2019. And the Saudis were like, what do you mean? You're supposed to bomb Iran now. And Trump didn't do so. After that, it caused a major rethink in the region, and they realized that they have to actually move towards resolving their own tensions. So us stepping back most likely will actually get these countries to work out their differences. And on top of that, we don't have to be involved in any of these wars. We don't have to lose any more lives, nor do we have to take any more lives. So the whole thing falls apart. So when the question then comes, what is the U.S. national interest? Right. That is of such importance that it causes Biden to think that it's worth all of these different risks that he's taking, including the escalation risk that he's accepting, unfortunately. I mean, he doesn't want it, but the way he's handling it is the wrong way in my view. And I just cannot see a single argument that justifies this policy.
Now, I understand a lot of people are very frustrated with Biden, but I don't know if any other candidate is any better. I mean, there are better candidates, but they're just not popular. Maybe don't have like Jill Stein doesn't have the momentum to really truly win the election. But Trump, I mean, look, the alternative at this point will be Trump, most likely. Do you think Trump would be any different, or would he be worse in this particular conflict?
Trump is so unpredictable. It's really difficult to tell. Right. I spoke to a person who is close to the Trump circles and understand their thinking quite well. And without joking, he said, look, he can imagine that Trump himself would have entered the war on week one, or that Trump would have called the head of Hamas, the head of Hezbollah and Netanyahu and said, hey, why don't you all come over to Mar-a-Lago and let's work this out. So the spectrum is this wide of what he could have done. But I'll give you a couple of arguments. I think Trump would likely have done pretty much the same thing to begin with. However, I think after 3 or so weeks, he would have grown tired of it.
Right.
And I think he would have, compared to Biden, taken the escalation risk much more seriously. Because Trump was very disinclined to go into any war that he did not see benefiting him politically. Mm-hmm. And let's say that he was in his first term and he actually had a second, he had an election coming up. Do you think he would be looking at these polls and be like, I don't care? No, right. I think he actually would be extremely worried about it. He always wanted to have an exit plan. He never wanted to go into any major, large military confrontations, despite his rhetoric and all the stuff that he was saying. So I actually think after 3 weeks, he would probably have gone in a different direction because he would have worried about the escalation risk and about the risk of the U.S. getting dragged into war, whose exit he couldn't see and most importantly, whose political benefit for him he could not see.
Right.
And as a result, I actually think that there's a likelihood that he would have handled this.
It's interesting. I think the biggest benefit of Trump is the fact that he is such a narcissist. I mean, he wants to be popular. He wants to be liked. And actually, that's how a politician should be, right? Instead, we got all these politicians that are bought off by different lobbies. And it's not the voter. It's not the people who are controlling the politician's behavior. It's instead these other forces behind them, because that's what, they're looking for, all of these other things. Trump, on the other hand, isn't bought off by all of those lobbies. He doesn't seem to care. He's like, oh, thanks. Yeah, whatever. He cares more about being liked. And as a politician, that's almost a better thing, because then whatever's popular with the people, he says, oh, the people are chanting, they want this. This is what they want. Well, then I'll do that and I'll be popular and they'll cheer. That's almost a benefit when it comes to a politician. That's how they should be. So maybe he would be seeing the
to extent, yes. But I mean, there's also really tough decisions that, look, for us to really be able to deal with climate, we're going to have to do things that people are not going to be happy about. And so far, we see no politicians having the courage actually pushing for those type of things. But I take your point, and I recognize that particularly in this type of a scenario, Trump knew very well that anti-war sentiment, particularly in the Republican Party, is the
Yeah.
key reason as to why he came to power. And he would be very careful not to gamble that away and suddenly turn around and be something else. And take a look at his record. He made all kinds of threats, and he used the worst language and spoke in a way that was extremely dangerous in my view. But when push came to shove, the only times we saw him actually take military action was when he thought that it benefited him politically, including the
Right.
assassination of Soleimani. Here, a year before the election, I don't think that he would see those type of things. And I think that would have caused him to act differently.
Yeah. Whereas Biden uses soft language, it's the opposite, right? Uses soft language, but then ultimately here we are sitting in two major proxy wars at the moment that are,
Certainly.
yeah,
And one thing about his soft language, though, I think one area in which Biden, I don't know if he doesn't have the empathy or if it's all part of another political calculation, but he seems to have a great difficulty expressing empathy for the suffering of the Palestinians. And he has been repeating on more than two occasions things that his own staff said were lies. I mean, this claiming that he saw the pictures of beheaded babies.
right.
That was not true. He had not seen it. The first time he said that, his staff later on had to call the New York Times and the other mainstream media and just clarify that he actually hadn't seen it. But then he used it again in another speech, and it wasn't a mistake. His staff had taken it out. He put it back in. So it really makes you wonder, why is he using lies that he knows are untrue, that are extremely inflammatory at the
Yeah.
end of the day, because it enrages people, of course. But it seems to potentially have been to, abuse that in order to get opinion to be further on his side, even though he's been losing it, perhaps out of desperation. But it shows a tremendous disregard for the suffering that is happening on the Palestinian side, which is, more than 21,000 dead at this point. And I think that's something that surprises people, because otherwise Joe Biden has been known for being the politician who was so empathetic, the average guy, from Pennsylvania or from Delaware. But that's not what we're seeing right now.
Why do Israel and the U.S. hate Iran in the first place? What has caused this animosity?
So it's a complex question, of course. And I think, unfortunately, there's much hatred going from all sides. I think if we just push aside the hatred and see, okay, what are the root causes of this conflict? The root causes of this conflict, in my view, is a geopolitical rivalry, particularly between Israel and Iran. When you take a look at Israel and Iran's history, they were actually close allies, secret allies in the 1950s and 60s. And they were not close allies because of some ideological reason. There were some ideological incomparability that was important. The Shah, for instance, was first very reluctant to get close to Israel until Israel clearly chose the Western camp in the Cold War. But after that, the key things that pushed the Israelis and the Iranians together were actually common threats. They sensed the threat from the Soviet Union, and they sensed the threat from strong pan-Arab nationalist states in the region, Iraq under Saddam, Egypt under Nasser, that they viewed as threats. And as a result, they had common strategic imperatives. Those common strategic imperatives survived the Iranian Revolution, because even after the revolution, the Soviet Union was still there. Iraq was even more powerful. And when Iraq actually attacked the Iranians in 1980, the Israelis were eager to help the Iranians, and the Iranians quietly accepted Israeli help because it made strategic sense for them. They had a war to fight. But another ideological dimension was added because of this new regime's ideological pan-Islamic identity. And the Iranians started using very aggressive rhetoric against the Israelis. predicting that Israel would fall apart, would not exist, rejecting its legitimacy, its right to exist, et cetera, et cetera. And for about 7 years, the Israelis were not happy with it. But behind the scenes, they were still helping the Iranians because
Are
they
you
didn't
talking
pay that
about?
much attention.
Are you talking? So this is after the fall of the Shah. The Ayatollah's in power now.
Exactly.
The U.S.
Exactly.
is. Do you think that some of that animosity and the reason why the Ayatollah started why Iran now under this new Islamic regime, why they started speaking that way was really because the United States at that point had majorly shifted its feelings towards Iran as well. When that happened, there
No,
was a
I
lot
think
of
it's a bit
aggression there.
separate. The Iranians took 52 American hostages,
Right.
diplomats hostage. And that's what really broke down the U.S.-Iran relationship. Now, from the perspective of the revolutionaries, they were doing so because the United States for more than 25 years had supported and trained the Shah's Secret Service, kept the Shah in power. Shah was using a lot of torture, and the United States was totally cool with that as long as the Shah was in the Western camp. So there was a lot of anger against the United States as the enabler of the Shah. In fact, when 1953, it was the United States that made a coup in Iran and reinstated the Shah after the Iranians actually had a nascent democracy back then. And the United States got rid of the democratically elected prime minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, and reinstated the Shah. And after that, the Shah actually became much, much worse than he was. So the United States lost much of its innocence with the Iranian people. So it was a major falling out between the U.S. and Iran over the revolution, the hostage crisis, but there wasn't that divergence between Israeli and Iranian interests. So the Israelis actually broke with the U.S. and they were violating U.S. sanctions. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Iran. No more American weapons, no more American spare parts could be sent to Iran. And Iran's entire military was based on American weaponry. Israelis openly violated this. Ariel Sharon was on American TV in 1982 and say, yes, Israel is providing weapons and spare parts, American spare parts to the Iranians in the hope that the Iranians will once again come back and have a strong alliance with the Israelis. And then the U.S. itself was in on it because in 1986, despite sanctions, despite everything it was saying publicly, it turned out that the Reagan administration was secretly sending weapons to Iran through the Israelis, with the help of the Israelis, in the hope that once Ayatollah Khomeini died, Iran would return to the Western. So you have a lot of secret dealings and dirty dealings. But what is really fascinating in all of this is that the type of enmity we see right now between Iran and Israel, with the assassination, as you mentioned, Iran's rhetoric against Israel, Iran's support for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, etc. All of that came in the 1990s, not in the 1980s when Iran was so much more revolutionary and ideological. It changed in the 1990s because the geopolitics changed in the 1990s. In the early 1990s, the last standing Arab army that could pose a military threat both to the Iranians and to Israel, which was the army of Saddam Hussein, was defeated by the United States and the UN coalition. And at the same time, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the two key factors that actually pushed the Iranians and Israelis closer together in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even in the 80s were now off the stage. And a new geopolitical environment arose in which, guess what? The Iranians and the Israelis started to emerge as two of the most powerful countries in the region. And now they started to view each other as threats. In fact, you see it in the early 1990s in Israeli press, in which they start talking about that the actual new threat is not the Arab vicinity, the inner circle of Arab states surrounding Israel, because they were all defeated more or less. But now it was the Persian periphery. It was the Iranians, the outer circle that was the real threat. And this was a complete inversion of Israeli strategic thinking. In the 1950s, Ben-Gurion had put together this doctrine that was called the Doctrine of the Periphery, in which Israel was trying to balance the immediate Arab states surrounding it by creating alliances with the non-Arab states in the outer circle, in the periphery. And those states were Turkey, Ethiopia, but the most important one was Iran. Now it was reversed. The inner states were pacified. They had signed peace treaties with Israel because there was a belief that perhaps Israel will eventually agree to a two-state solution. And now the new threat, geopolitical threat, was seen as Iran. And ever since, that's when the Israelis started to push the United States to sanction Iran, isolate Iran, all of those different things, which is the opposite of what the Israelis were doing in the 1980s. There's a letter from Shimon Peres to Ronald Reagan in 1986, at a time when Hezbollah, which is an Iranian ally, had taken Americans hostage in Beirut. And this was something that Reagan personally was very upset about. And Peres says that you have to overcome the obstacle in Lebanon in order to bring Iran back into the Western. So back in the 80s, Israelis were the ones who were selling arms to Iran, telling the U.S. to talk to Iran, and also telling the U.S. not to pay attention to Iranian rhetoric because Iranian rhetoric was not important. 1990s, everything is reversed.
So, what is Iran trying to do? We hear them chant death to America, death to Israel. What is Iran's strategy, do you think, when it comes to Israel? Do you think they really want to eradicate the Jewish nation? Are they wanting and push all the Jews somewhere else, like to Europe or something? What do you think their end game is, their goal?
I don't think so. And I think it may sound strange to say that I don't think, but I actually don't think that that is their end game. First of all, Iran has the largest community of Jews in the Middle East outside of Israel itself. Iran has had a Jewish minority for 2,500 years. Iranian Jews actually like to point out that there's been Jews in Iran 1,000 years before there were any Muslims in Iran. So this goes back historically when Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire, conquered Babylonia and freed the Jewish people from the Babylonian imprisonment. And 1/3 of the population actually voluntarily migrated to southern Iran, which was the Persian Empire, the main center of the world at the time. And the Iranian Jews of today are descendants of those Jews. So I don't think that is, if they wanted to just eliminate all Jews, they would have done so with their own Jews, and they haven't. That's not to say that they're not discriminating against Jews. That's not to say that there's not a lot of very, very negative things going on. But when it comes to the question, what is their end game? I don't even think that they actually would want to see Israel completely defeated. I think that part of the reason why the Shah was supporting Israel, because he was afraid that if Israel was not absorbing some of the Arab anger, that Arab anger would be directed towards Iran because of Iran's own historical problems with Arab states. And of course, we saw the Iran. Now, this regime, the Islamic Republic, has pursued a different strategy in which it is trying to overcome Arab-Persian tensions as well as Sunni-Shia tensions by its brand of political Islam. And is trying to create commonalities with the Arab populations of the region. And as a result, believes that he has a better chance, even if Israel is out. Although I don't think that they would entirely, I think they would probably prefer a much weakened Israel that is still there, is still somewhat of a tension, but something that is not entirely allowing Arab states to shift their gaze away from Palestine.
Interesting.
So again, it's very complicated. There's no purity in all of this. The Iranians have been talking a big pro-Palestinian game, but in the 1980s, as much as they were talking a lot, they were still dealing extensively with Israel.
Right. I mean, it's pretty straightforward in my view. It's pretty clever. I mean, if there is a big, what people don't understand is that in the Muslim world, the Al-Qaeda's, the ISIS, the real Salafi Muslims, they hate more than anybody the Shia Muslims. That's who they hate more than anybody. That's who they believe they have a godly duty to kill, right? Are Shias, because they're worse than somebody who's Christian or some other faith. They're claiming to be Muslim, but they're practicing something totally different. And to them, that is like the worst offense ever. So you're saying that Iran's strategy is, okay, in order to lessen the hate that they have for us, the Sunni Shia, war. We're on your side, guys. We both are against Israel. So we're friends, we're teammates.
So let me give you an example. Yasser Arafat shows up in Iran 10 days after the Iranian Revolution, uninvited and unannounced. And he goes over and he has a 2-hour meeting with Ayatollah Khomeini that could not have gone worse. Here's Arafat. He's like the hero of the third world. He's like the Che Guevara level revolutionary, right? And he comes to this countryside redneck Ayatollah that just kind of emerged on the international scene. And Ayatollah Khomeini is essentially lecturing Arafat for 2 hours and is blasting Arafat for having pursued an Arab nationalist cause for Palestine. And he was telling him that it has to be an Islamic cause. And part of the reason for this is the Iranian calculation that Iran wants to be a leader in the Muslim world, or during the time of the Shah in West Asia. Iran has been an empire for 2,000, or actually 3,000 years, has been a superpower for most of its history, and sees as its natural given birthright to be a leading power in the region. Now, the Shah defined it in, Persian nationalist terms. It didn't have an ideological or religious dimension. It had a geographic dimension. Khomeini had the same ambition, probably even greater, but defined it in religious terms. Iran was going to be the leader of the Islamic world. And to do so, again, it needed to overcome the Arab-Persian and the Sunni Shia thing. But more importantly, if the most important cause in the Muslim world, the Palestinian cause, was defined as an Arab cause, where was Iran's leadership role? It needed to be redefined as an Islamic cause in order for Iran to have that type of leadership. And this was not something that Arafat, who was not particularly religious to begin with, was sympathetic to at all. Mm-hmm. So they had a very bad meeting. But the Iranians had promised the Palestinians a lot of support. And I think Arafat had a lot of expectation that Iran would end up becoming a very pro-Palestinian state that would support them. But within a year or so, it started becoming very clear that Iran was just talking a lot. It was not really ready to actually give much to the Palestinians. Its focus was elsewhere. And in order to make sure that Arafat's criticism of Ayatollah Khomeini and the Iranians would essentially be forgotten and would be washed away, guess what the Iranians did? They installed a big march in Iran called Jerusalem Day, in which they would march and call for Jerusalem to be the capital of the Palestinian state. They started doing a lot of different or show things. Competitions for kids to do drawings of a free Palestine. All of these kind of things, and a very anti-Israeli rhetoric to actually cover up that in substance, their policy had not really shifted in favor of the Palestinians in the way that the Arafat and the PLO wanted it.
Well, hopefully, I mean, how do you think the two countries, Israel and Iran, and that region, how do you think they could possibly come back together and be I mean, I don't know if I'd go as far as to say friends. It would be nice, but at least without not being at each other's throats the way that they are.
So here's the good news. If this actually was an ideological battle, then there is no solution. There is no such thing as a draw in an ideological battle. It's the victory of one over the other.
Yeah.
But because this ultimately actually is a geopolitical battle, there's many solutions. And there can be draws, there can be coexistence. I think the ideology clearly is a factor. It's there. I don't think it's a driving force necessarily, but it can't be ignored. But I think there's another factor that is more important, that is more concerning. And that is the paradigm of security that currently exists in the region as a whole, but particularly on the Israeli side, there's a factor. There's a paradigm that I think is extremely problematic, which is that the Israelis believe, because of their experience, because of the experience of the Jewish people, that they have to dominate the region militarily, and they have to be able to outgun not only every country in the region, but every combination of countries in the region. in order for them to be safe. There's no managing of threats. It's elimination of threats and a complete military preponderance. So essentially, safety only comes through military hegemony. So usually when countries assess the threats, the equation, a simplified equation, is to take threat equals capacity times intent. The Israeli calculation is that intent is always a constant one, meaning the region is always intent on destroying Israel. So the only thing that matters then is capability. So Israel has to completely outgun everyone and every combination. There is no way that Iran is going to accept, the country of 80 million with its history, to accept living under Israeli military hegemony.
Right.
And there's always also no way, in my view, that Israel is going to be able to survive as a successful state if its strategy is that security comes through hegemony. It's just not going to work out. The cost is too high. The number of wars is going to have to fight. Already, just take a look at the track record.
Yeah.
There has to be a profound paradigm shift that allows for coexistence, because even though the ideological one is not the driving force and does not allow for coexistence, the military doctrine here doesn't allow for that either. Because again, from the Israeli standpoint, perhaps they think it can be successful because essentially they're living next to giant Egypt and they have outgunned the Egyptians, and many other states. But I think it's going to be a completely different experience with the Iranians. And so I think unless you have a shift, not only on what the Iranians are saying about Israel, not rejecting his right to exist, but also on the Israeli side, this idea of military hegemony for survival, that has to change the world. And the reason I start off with that is because that's the thing you almost never hear. In all other interviews, whoever you would interview would tell you first, well, look, the Iranians have to come to terms with Israel. I don't disagree with that, but it's not even half. There's not going to be any coexistence unless there's a shift in Israel's strategic thinking at all.
Yeah, which it's not going to have under Netanyahu, that's for sure. It's going to need.
Well, even without, I think there's a little bit. I think there's a bit of a danger. Now, it's understandable. Netanyahu has been prime minister for so long. He takes such pride in being the one that is always, elbowing the U.S. But if you scratch the surface, who are the others in Israel left that are not thinking like Netanyahu?
Yeah.
I mean, the left in Israel is more or less destroyed, or they have migrated out. They're not living in Israel any longer. All of the other candidates tend to actually be in some ways to the right of Netanyahu. Personifying the problem to Netanyahu, I think, is a problem because it gives us the illusion that there is currently a different Israel out there that is just dramatically different. I don't see it. I hope it's there. I hope it will emerge at some point. But I don't see it right now. The political leadership right now in Israel is just different variations of Netanyahu's own thinking.
Yeah, I've thought about that as well. Like, who would they replace him with? Benny Gantz, or I mean, they all think exactly the same way. Some of them are even worse. They're even more hardline than Netanyahu. So you could end up with somebody much worse than him, because you're right. Even those who are supposed to be more on the left are not at all. They're still very, there's a lot of very genocidal rhetoric. Really, they're pretty flat out and blatant about it. I mean, here in the United States, you got a lot of people who are ignoring that language, ignoring it and saying, oh, that's not true. It's the Holocaust is really truly against the Jews. It's not against the Palestinians. And meanwhile, in Israel, the actual rhetoric coming from the actual people in charge is exactly genocidal. They're saying we have to get rid of all these people. I mean, they'll just say it flat out. I mean, I don't know how much more blatant you need, but it is dire.
And I think we can blame Netanyahu for a lot of this because he has driven a campaign to push Israel very, very much to an extremist position.
Yeah.
So now the entire spectrum is covered by people that are taking positions. And when you watch some of these things, it makes you wonder what kind of circumstances needed to exist for people to feel so comfortable to speak so openly about their intent for genocide.
Yeah.
Even say that I cannot sleep unless I see buildings in Gaza fall. I need more of them. I need 150,000 dead during the first week. I mean, this didn't come out of nowhere right away. This is not just something that one horrible attack by Hamas could have caused. There's something that preceded that. And that is, I think, 20 years of dehumanization of the Palestinians, no accountability from the United States, constantly giving them a free hand and a carte blanche, even though it's been so blatantly clear from 1996 when Netanyahu first came to power. He ran on an anti-two-state solution platform. He's always been trying to undermine it. He's openly admitting it now. And we can't point to him as if he's guilty because most Western politicians played along for 20 years, even though they knew that this is exactly the man that Netanyahu was.
Yeah, it is very radical over there. And really on both sides. There's a lot of radical on both sides. When I went over there, I could not believe, I mean, here in the United States, we talk about, oh, there's extremists amongst us and there's radicals amongst us. And you just don't know radical, you don't know extreme until you go over there. It's a whole different ball game, whole different set of rhetoric. I mean, it's very, and so it's going to be very difficult. But I don't think it's right to even there's a lot of people here in the United States who really believe in this war. They think Israel's doing the right thing, and they say it's because the Palestinians want to eradicate the Israelis, and so therefore the Israelis can eradicate the Palestinians. I don't believe you could genocide another group just because they want to genocide you, if that were true. I don't think that's an excuse for genocide. Well, they want to genocide me, so I got to genocide them first. I don't think that's good enough, but I certainly hope that they come to, I hope there's more pressure. I mean, I don't know how this ends, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good at this point, unless there's a lot of pressure on Israel to stop. But I think Netanyahu's got a plan.
And of all the different kind of scenarios that we're hearing about, the defeat of Hamas and then replacing them with some variation of reinvigorated PA.
Right.
All of them sound completely fanciful and far less likely, I have to say, including the defeat of Hamas, then that in 2 months' time, the United States will actually shift and put pressure on Israel. I find that to be more likely, despite of the obstinate position that Biden has taken so far, because the other ones are simply not achievable. The amount of killing that needs to take place to be able to take out Hamas. I mean, 11 weeks into it, more and more voices are being raised that Israelis are actually not succeeding in doing this. They're killing a lot of people. They're not destroying Hamas.
Right.
And we should have known that, should have communicated that quite clearly to the Israelis, given our own experience. I mean, we have those internal documents in which Rumsfeld is complaining that for every insurgent that was being killed in Iraq, 2 more were created.
Yeah.
Because of the trauma and the radicalization that came because of these campaigns. And those campaigns, as I understand it, were not at all as intense and as indiscriminate as what we're seeing in Gaza right now. We're talking about 2,000-pound bombs that are supposed to be breaking up bunkers that are being dropped in residential areas. People 300 feet away are being killed. How can you claim that that is not complete indiscriminate?
Yeah.
And how can you think that that is not going to radicalize an entire generation? In fact, I forgot his name now, but one of the heads of Hamas was 8 years old back in the late 1940s when his family was rounded up by early Israeli state soldiers and executed. And he saw his entire family being executed. He's one of the heads of Hamas. Yeah. That's how that journey starts, unfortunately. And there's a lot of those journeys, unfortunately, that are being started right now, I think.
It's true. And I don't think they're just radicalizing Palestinians. I think they're actually, a lot of people are wanting to join. I mean, you've got people from around the world who are seeing what's happening saying, I want to go join Hamas and fight against Israel. I mean, they're radicalizing more against them than for them. It's a bad strategy. And I hope that they come to their senses. I hope the U.S. comes to their senses. I hope everybody comes to their senses and that we end up having a better new year. I'm hoping that 2024, everybody comes to their senses and we severely de-escalate, because we absolutely need that. Trita, it was really great getting this more of a deep dive into what is going on. And I certainly learned a lot about Iran and I think it's particularly interesting that Iran and Israel were friends, or, kind of had an alliance there for a while, even after the fall of the Shah. A lot of people think all the problems happened when the Ayatollah came to power, but I think there were a lot of problems with the Shah as well. And Iran really just kind of needs to be left alone to handle their own situation rather than having any sort of meddling from the United States or anywhere else. But very insightful. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Have a happy new year. Hopefully it's a good one.
You too.
Thank you.
Good talking to you.
All right, guys, that is it for tonight's show. Thank you so much for joining us. If you want to get more of Trita's work and his books and more information, definitely follow him at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and that link is down below. Really appreciate that conversation. And do hope that we have a better 2024. So that is, 2023, I was really hopeful about. I was like, all right, the pandemic is pretty much over. I think this is going to be a good year, but it wasn't quite over. People are still kind of weird. And I think for me, 2023 was a tough year for a lot of reasons. I'm hoping 2024 is a good one. I hope it's a great one for you. It's going to be an interesting one. We do have an election this year. And that one's going to be wild from my estimation. I think it's going to be really wild. And hopefully we don't have war on top of that wildness, election wildness. And hopefully we don't have another, pandemic, knock on wood. That's the last thing we want. So let's hope that this is a good one. Cheers to 2024. Thank you guys so much for joining us. We will be back tomorrow night with another great show, 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern. Until then, Happy New Year. Bye-bye.